Gonzaga looked nearly flawless in a dominant win over Oregon State on Tuesday, and with St. Mary's on deck, this team once again appears to be peaking at the perfect time.
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Happy Tuesday, and welcome into the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Randy Patton, here to bring you news and updates on all things Zag athletics. Today's episode of Locked On Zags is brought to you by FanDuel. Folks, Super Bowl 59 is here, and there is no better way to make every play more exciting than with FanDuel Sportsbook. New customers can bet just $5, and if you win, you'll score $200 in bonus bets. Download the app or head to FanDuel.com to get started. Well, how much fun do we just have on Tuesday night, folks? Gonzaga stomped out Oregon State at the Kennel. We're going to discuss the star performers, the transfers having remarkable games. Graham Ike getting this thing off to a rockin' start. We're also going to talk about some of the other stats in this game, what it might mean for the Zags going forward, and we'll end the show talking about how much ESPN loves having Gonzaga in these late night hoops slots and what it might mean for the Pac-12 and their ongoing media rights negotiations. We'll get to that to close out the show, but let's start just celebrating. Folks, we haven't celebrated a lot in the last couple of weeks. Gonzaga has that heartbreaking loss 12 days ago, 13 days, as many of you are listening to this, against that Oregon State team. Lose that game in overtime, come out really flat in a listless, frankly embarrassing performance against Santa Clara 2 days later, lose that game giving up 103 points at the Kennel. And then they go out, they have a whole week off, they beat Portland, and it was great. They had a starting lineup change. Ben Gregg went completely insane. Mike Ajayi looks great, but it was Portland. And yeah, it was a road game, but it was a road game at the Chiles Center, which rarely feels like much of a road game for Gonzaga. This was the litmus test. This was the barometer. How does Gonzaga, we wanted to know how they respond from that loss to Santa Clara, and we got a glimpse of it in that game against Portland, but this was the meat and potatoes. This was us really seeing how this team responded from their two embarrassing performances the prior week. Once again, Emmanuel Innocenti starts in place of Khalif Battle. I think that's a change that is going to continue to happen. It worked perfectly in this game. Khalif Battle, incredible performance from him. This is the player we've been wanting to see. This is the player I've been pulling my beard hair out all season long because this is the guy we've been wanting to see. I felt like a broken record on the podcast. Why isn't Khalif Battle going to the rim? Why is he settling for threes? Why isn't the player who took 6 free throw attempts per game at Arkansas last year, why isn't he that guy in this system? And finally, in a glorious stretch late in the first half in this game, Khalif Battle looked like the exact player that we want him to be. And he still hit threes. He was 3 of 4 from beyond the arc in this game. He was 4 of 5 overall from the field in this game. But he finished the game with 23 points because he went 12 of 13 from the free throw line. That's the player. That's the player right there. Because it opens up everything for Gonzaga. When he is the focal point offensively, when he is getting to his right hand, getting to the rim, drawing contact and getting to the line, it puts pressure on the defense. It forces them to play more timidly. If they have foul trouble, it forces them to get further into their bench. It slows down their momentum with the free throw line, and it opens up the offense. If Battle's driving and defenders have to collapse on him, he can look to swing it out. You can get open three-point shooters that way. We saw Nolan Hickman capitalize by hitting a bunch of threes late in this game, in part due to the pressure that Battle puts on the rim. This is the player Gonzaga got on day one, and it took him a long time between Coach Few and the staff, between Battle himself, to figure out how to utilize him. And boy, does it look fantastic when he's doing what he's supposed to be doing. Incredible game from Khalif Battle. Got to mention Graham Ike. We said one of the keys to this game, we'll talk about it more in the second segment, was for Graham to cook. He cooked 11 of Gonzaga's first 13 points. I mean, this thing felt over before it even began, and Oregon State was still in the game. But the way that Graham just effortlessly dominated early in this contest, you could tell that the Beavers were in for a tough night, and it got worse and worse for them. Also, we talked about Khalif Battle. Got to give a shout out to the other star transfer portal addition, Michael Ajayi. Folks, he's got his mojo back. It's back. This is the guy. Talk about Khalif Battle looking like the guy we've wanted to see. Michael Ajayi in the last 2 games. He had a 20-burger against Portland, most of those coming in the second half, most of them coming when the game was already well out of reach. So again, how much of that did we want to take super seriously for Ajayi? I think I said on that Monday show, yes, we don't want to glean too much from Ajayi scoring 20 primarily against Portland's backups in a 35-point game, but we thought maybe it's going to give him some confidence going forward. I've never seen Michael Ajayi look more confident. In my entire life of watching this player play basketball, I have never seen Michael look more confident than he did in this game against the Oregon State Beavers. 15 points, 10 rebounds, has a double-double. The only player for Gonzaga to record a double-double. He did it in 19 minutes coming off the bench. He was phenomenal in this game. 6 of 10 from the field, 2 of 3 from the three-point line. If we're going to nitpick, 1 of 3 from the charity stripe, that's about it. That's about it. What a game for Michael Ajayi. If he is this player and Khalif Battle is that player, this team, I don't want to say unstoppable because they still have some things they need to work on. They still have, the consistency is obviously the thing we need to see. And the defensive, we need to see the defense stick after 2 great performances in a row. But if Khalif Battle and Michael Ajayi are the players that we thought we were going to get, which they both looked exactly like that in this game, people are going to be worried. St. Mary is going to be shaken a little bit ahead of that game on Saturday in Moraga. The rest of the WCC quivering. Whatever team draws this Gonzaga team, they get hot the rest of the year. They're still probably not going to get they're not going to get higher than a 6 seed is probably the max for them. Maybe a 5. We didn't think 5 was possible last year. Maybe it's in the cards for them this year. But whatever team draws them, if they're playing like this, oh boy, people are not going to want to play this team at this point. And I mentioned it. Khalif Battle had a great game. Emmanuel Innocenti, statistically, he didn't score. He had 2 points and 2 assists in 17 minutes, 0 of 2 from the field. That's not going to stand out for those of you box score hunting. But let me tell you, he's a perfect fit in the starting lineup for this team. A perfect fit. Because Gonzaga's starting lineup with Battle and Hickman and Nembhard and EK and Greg basically features 4 players who are fairly ball dominant. What I mean by that, Nembhard needs the ball in his hands, not to score because he's not a score-first player, but to facilitate, to get things going. He's a ball-dominant player. He needs to be on the ball. Hickman is not as much. Maybe it's 3.5 ball dominant players on the starting lineup because Hickman, he's a catch and shoot 3-point specialist. He's a secondary creator, but he's somebody who's not a great defensive player and more focused on what he can do offensively, primarily as a perimeter scorer. Khalif Battle, very ball dominant, on ball type player. He needs the ball in his hands to make anything happen offensively. Graham Ike, of course, an incredibly high usage big. Ben Gregg, not as much of a ball dominant player and more of a defensive minded player, but kind of the only player in that starting lineup in that vein. And what happens for Gonzaga is they can't get everybody going. How many times this year has it been 6 or 7 minutes into the game before we realize, okay, this player has the hot hand. Tonight it's Braden. Tonight it's Graham. Tonight it's Khalif. Tonight it's Ben. It takes Gonzaga a while to find it. And I think part of that was having too many cooks in the kitchen, too many starters who all needed the ball in their hands and not enough, even with the best point guard in the country, a maestro in Ryan Nembhard, they couldn't figure out how to get everybody going. And of course, the flip side of that, they struggled mightily defensively. Now you add Emmanuel Innocenti, who's like a Mike Hart clone, the 2025 version of Mike Hart. He floats around the perimeter offensively. He doesn't turn the ball over, but he doesn't look to shoot. He doesn't look to score. He'll get a couple assists. He'll get a couple of rebounds, and he just plays lockdown, in your face perimeter defense on the other end of the floor. He is the perfect player to have in this starting lineup because now you can focus on getting the ball to Graham. You can focus on getting the ball to Ben or Michael if he's in the game, or letting Nolan get some shots up, or running the pick and roll with Ryan and Graham. And you don't have to worry about feeding everybody else. And then you can bring Khalif into the game either with Braden or with Michael, where he's not as focused on getting the ball in his hands. And you can have Khalif in a system where maybe with Dusty in the game as well, Khalif then gets more autonomy to run the offense, to go after the bucket, to drive to the rim. And he's not forced to be kind of pigeonholed into a role where he's the 3rd or 4th option offensively when that's not who Khalif Battle is. Let him come off the bench and cook. It is the perfect move, a shrewd move by Mark Few that I really sincerely hope he continues to utilize going forward this season, because I think it was the perfect move, and we've seen it pay off handsomely through these first 2 games of that starting lineup change. Couple other things to mention. Zags 9 of 17 from 3, incredible. Nolan Hickman 4 of 6, just caught absolute flames in the second half of this game. Battle was 3 of 4. Michael Ajayi, like we said, 2 of 3. The only really bad thing to mention in this game was just another quiet night from Dusty Stromer. He's been fairly quiet lately. He's kind of been really the only player, with maybe the exception of Braden Huff, who really hasn't kind of shined in these last 2 games after the sloppiness that we saw from the whole team in that Santa Clara game. He didn't score until about 2 minutes left in this game. The Zags were up 38 when he scored his first points of the game on a long 2, finished with 2 points on 1 of 2. He had 3 fouls. He commits a lot of off-ball fouls. It's just a frustrating thing from a young player who it almost feels like a little bit of regression, and it's just a slump. I don't think it's problematic for him like long-term, but if you're going to talk about the bad in this game, and as I talked about in the last few games, I'm going to always find the good, even in games that are not good, like the Santa Clara game. I'm always going to find the good. I'm still going to find some of the bad things, even in good games like this. And Dusty Stromer, again, for this team to be firing on all cylinders, he needs to be a little bit better. And I think the cheap fouls away from the ball are killer for this Gonzaga team, and something he really needs to start sharpening up going forward this season. We talked about some of our keys for Gonzaga in this game, locking down Oregon State star Mikey Ratai. We talked about getting off to a strong start in the second half. We're going to talk about those and a few other keys we laid out and how they played out on Tuesday, all coming up in just a second. But first, folks, Super Bowl 59, it's here. 1 game, 2 teams, endless possibilities, and there's no better way to make every play more exciting than with FanDuel Sportsbook. Whether it's predicting the first touchdown, calling the MVP, or even betting on the coin toss, FanDuel makes it easy to get in on the action. With live betting all game long, you can adjust your bets as the game unfolds and feel the thrill from kickoff to the final whistle. The live betting feature lets you stay involved no matter what happens on the field, and the app, it's super easy to navigate. Plus, knowing that you can place a $5 bet and potentially win $200 in bonus bets for the Super Bowl, that is the icing on the cake. Well, St. Mary's, tonight, they play Santa Clara on the road. They're 4.5-point favorites. It's a tough road environment. We've seen what this Broncos team can do. Maybe St. Mary's looking a little bit ahead to Saturday, maybe shaking in their boots a little bit about that game against Gonzaga. I don't know. Santa Clara could pull off an upset here. Definitely a game worth keeping an eye on. Maybe toss some money down, see if you can get $200 in bonus bets for betting against the Gales. That's an incredible Wednesday for everybody out there. If you want to do that, join the app or head to FanDuel.com to get started. You just bet $5 if you win, $200 in bonus bets. Again, that's FanDuel.com. Bet with FanDuel, an official partner of Super Bowl 59. All right, folks, segment 2, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags podcast. And yeah, we're still sitting back, relaxing, celebrating a 38-point win for Gonzaga over the Oregon State Beavers. Their first win over Oregon State, mind you, since 1932. A fun fact that Roxy Bernstein loved to bring up on the broadcast, tongue-in-cheek, as these teams obviously had not played each other very much in that stretch of time. By the way, they showed this at the end of the game for anybody who turned it off a little early. The score, the last time Gonzaga beat Oregon State in 1932, the score was 27-24. I just feel like that is an important stat for people to know. A little bit different scoring era back then. Anyway, here what we're going to do in the second segment, we're going to look at the 5 keys we laid out coming into this game and kind of how they played out on Tuesday. Key number 1 for Gonzaga was to lock down Michael Ratai, a WCC Player of the Year candidate coming into this game, 6'9" junior forward. He had scored 29 against the Zags in that game at Gill Coliseum. He had a pair of threes in overtime. He was a menace against Gonzaga in that game. And in this game, not so much. Was unable to make the same kind of impact. He had 7 points and 3 of 5 shooting in the first about 8 minutes of this game. Looked like, okay, the only reason Oregon State was even still in the game about 10 minutes in was because of Michael Ratai. But then Michael Ajayi comes into the game, picks up a charge on Ratai, which was his second foul. This was with about 7 minutes to go in the first half. It was a bit of a questionable call. I think that's fair to say, but it forced Ratai to the bench for the final 7 minutes of the first half. That was when Khalif Battle went nuclear and scored basically almost all of his points in the game. At least his 19 first half points pretty much all came in that little stretch. And then Ratai comes back in to start the second half, ends up finishing the game with 15 points, 6 of 11 shooting. He didn't have a bad night, but his impact was so limited in this game because the game was out of reach so early in the contest. He just wasn't a particularly impactful player. Yeah, he led this team in scoring in this game, was one of 4 players in double figures, but didn't really ever impact Oregon State's chances of winning this basketball game. Key number 2, also on the defensive end for Gonzaga, was to lock down the perimeter. Oregon State was pretty good from 3 in the first half. They were 5 of 12, which is about 41%. But even so, it was kind of some goofiness. DeMarco Minor, who's a very talented player, didn't have a great game here, but was good against them last time. And you could tell he's a problem for Oregon State. He hit a 3 in the closing seconds of a shot clock, like 8 or 9 minutes to go in the first half. Just like defenders draped all over him, pulls up from 3 as the clock's winding down. He did this in the game against Gill Coliseum. I think he's good for one of those per game. He's just that kind of clutch shooter. So that was one of their 5 made threes. Another one, Lelovicius, I'm probably getting his name wrong. Graham Ike blocked somebody at the rim. I think it was Matthew Marsh. And he literally shoved the shot straight to Lelovicius out on the perimeter. He caught it. He was wide open. He knocks down a 3. It's like, okay, fine. Sometimes you just get a little lucky. The ball lands right in your hands and you can knock down an open shot. Those were took those with a little bit of a grain of salt. And then the 3-point shooting that was so strong in the first half for Oregon State completely vanished in the second half. They finished 6 of 23, meaning they went a disgusting 1 of 11 from 3 in the second half as Gonzaga just absolutely rolled to a victory in that one. Key number 3 for Gonzaga was to force turnovers and get out in transition. Oregon State has a bit of an issue turning the basketball over. We talked about it coming into the game that they turned the ball over a fair amount on the road as well. Indeed, in this game, Oregon State 13 turnovers compared to just 6 for Gonzaga. Gonzaga finishes with 23 points off turnovers in totality. They had 15 fast break points, so not a ton of points out in transition, but they got out when they could. They got plenty of points out there early in the game. I think we had a steal from Nolan Hickman very early in this game that led out to a transition. Emmanuel Innocenti missed a lay-in at the rim and a transition opportunity that Graham Ike cleaned up, but we saw them kind of do that early in the game. By pretty early in the second half, Gonzaga was already kind of scaling back from running out in transition because they had a big enough lead they could just burn some clock. So we didn't see them take as many of those opportunities later on in the game. Key number 4 for Gonzaga, the key that's been on every single one of these lists this entire season: start hot, start the second half hot. And it's rarely a key that we can talk about in a positive way, but that's the case here. The Zags had a 17-9 lead at the first media timeout. 13 of those points were scored by Graham Ike. He was literally beating Oregon State by 4 at the first media timeout of this game. It was a little closer than that for most of the first few minutes of this game. I think it was like a tie game at right around the 16-minute mark, but then Gonzaga went on a spurt, and the first media timeout wasn't until like 13 and a half minutes to go. So at that point, Gonzaga had already built up a comfortable 8-point lead. They ended up being up by 20 at halftime, and then one of the biggest areas Gonzaga has struggled this year is the start of the second half. Even in games where they're blowing the team out, they tend to play even to start the second half, but not in this game. Wayne Tinkle had to call a timeout 1 minute and 11 seconds in to the second half because Gonzaga had already gone on a 5-0 run. They were up 20 to start the second half. They were up 25 a minute into the second half. Tinkle burns a timeout. At that point, by the time we got to the under 16 media timeout, Gonzaga had outscored Oregon State by 7 in the first 8 or so minutes, not even 8, like 5 or 6 minutes of the second half, and that was it. The Oregon State never truly challenged after that. Gonzaga held a comfortable 20-plus point lead, expanded it to 30, nearly got it to 40 by the time things were over in Spokane. Key number 5, we already talked about this a few times, but this was a key a lot early in the season and it hasn't been as much lately, but we thought we'd bring it back in this one. Let Graham cook, because Graham was so good against Oregon State in that game at Gill Coliseum. He's the only player for Gonzaga who truly had a great game top to bottom. He hit that clutch 3-pointer to send that game into overtime. I think he had 26. He was just a menace against Parsifala, the big man for Oregon State. And I thought, hey, he's going to be able to do that again against this team. Graham is an emotional man. He was pissed off about losing that game to Oregon State. So you knew he was going to come out firing. But man, I don't know if I could have even told you that he was going to have 11 of Gonzaga's first 13 points. That he was going to be that dominant early in this game. He was running the floor. He was beating guys up and down the floor, scoring in transition. He was scoring around the rim. He was cleaning up offensive rebounds. He blocked a shot or multiple. Like, he just had an incredible dominant game. He finished with 22 points, 7 rebounds, and an assist. That was in just 20 minutes because he didn't need to play most of the second half. 22 points, 7 rebounds, and an assist. He was 10 of 12 from the field. He was 2 of 3 from the free throw line. I don't know if Graham needed the extra motivation knowing that he was going up against a guy who's in the WCC Player of the Year conversation in Michael Ratai, but he sure looked like the better player in this game. If he can carry that motivation against Augustus Marcelonis, I know they don't play the same position, but Graham knows who he lost that award to last year. If he can have that motivation on Saturday, that is going to be great news for the Zags in that game against the Gales. All right, folks, moving on here to close out the show, talking about the ESPN of it all. This game was on ESPN2, not right away. Thank you, Baylor and BYU, for going into overtime. But Gonzaga and ESPN have had a long-standing relationship. We're going to talk about what that might mean for the Pac-12 as they continue their negotiations for a new media rights deal. All that coming up here in just a second. All right, folks, segment 3, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags podcast. Tuesday night, 8 p.m. on ESPN2 was the supposed start time for this Gonzaga game against the Oregon State Beavers. Of course, it got pushed back about 10 minutes, ended up starting on ESPN Plus because despite it being like a 6-point game with like a minute and a half left, of course, the game between Baylor and BYU went into overtime. That is such a staple of the Gonzaga basketball experience, is that the game in front of them goes into overtime or has delays. In this case, there was both. There was an official review with 2 minutes to go, and then there was overtime. Classic stuff. Not here to just talk about that, though. We know that Gonzaga and ESPN have had a long relationship. Gonzaga basketball games have very frequently been featured on ESPN's flagship channels, ESPN, ESPN2, occasionally ESPNU, and they like them because they want to fill that late night slot. They need to have something on TV that's going to fill valuable airtime at between 6 and 8 to 9 p.m. Pacific time. And Gonzaga basketball is the premier product on the West Coast for them to feature on their channels between January and March, December and March in some cases. You know, obviously they have other sports going on that they can get out there, but for the most part, as a college basketball entity, this is the game that Gonzaga wants, or this is the product that ESPN wants to feature on TV. The Pac-12 currently, and they're being very tight-lipped about all of this, which is why we have not had a lot of conversations about the Pac-12 and their continued, searching for more teams to add to the conference and their continued conversations for a new media rights deal. But the Pac-12 is on the hunt. They're on the hunt to fill out their conference. They're on the hunt to find the media right deals, multiple deals, to put this product together to get the most money for their schools, to get this product on the most TV screens as they possibly can. All the stuff that you need to do to be a viable conference to get back to autonomous status. That is what the Pac-12 is working on right now. We know that Teresa Gould, the commissioner of the Pac-12, met with multiple media rights partners while out at the College Football Championship a couple weekends ago. And we know the Pac-12 is talking to a handful of companies. We know that they still have a relationship with the CW, which showed a lot of Pac-12 football games last year. We know that they are in conversation with Warner Brothers, which is TNT, and some of those other channels as well. We know they're looking streaming. And they're looking at some innovative ways to have some opportunities there, whether that's Amazon Prime, whether that's Peacock, whether that's Max, whether that's even other potential alternatives in the streaming game. But we also know that ESPN is still in the mix, that ESPN remains in the picture for Pac-12, and likely because of Gonzaga's TV power. We know that the data collected by Octagon, which is also the same consulting company that not only worked with Gonzaga and helped them get into the Pac-12, Octagon is now working directly with the Pac-12. So we know that this data, that Gonzaga is one of the most watched college basketball programs in the country. I believe the only schools ahead of them were Kansas, Duke, Kentucky, and I think it was Michigan State, maybe North Carolina. I can't remember. Gonzaga, top 5, top 6 in TV power nationally. People watch the Zags on TV. ESPN's aware of that. Pac-12 very clearly aware of that because the consulting firm that found that data is working directly with them. So what does that mean? It means that the Pac-12, in theory, is going to try to leverage ESPN's love of Gonzaga into having them as part of their media rights package. It seems plausible that this will be something that happens. How much? Hard to say. ESPN obviously already has their deal with the SEC. They have Big 12 games as well. I don't know how much money they want to allocate to the Pac-12. I don't know if the Pac-12 is interested in a deal that where the ESPN says, hey, we're good on football, but we want your basketball. Is that appealing to the Pac-12? Are they kind of going to say no on principle? Does it matter on the money? Like, there's a lot of different conversations and questions that kind of need to be answered there. One of which is the Pac-12 could conceivably start to pivot towards building a more basketball-centric conference, likely not out of their top option, more out of, I don't want to say desperation, but out of assessing the options that are available to them. Let's put it that way. The main hinge right now for the Pac-12 in terms of anything, in terms of the media rights deal and in terms of conference realignment and expansion, is getting the schools from the American Athletic Conference, namely Memphis and Tulane, with North Texas and South Florida and a few other schools kind of in that conversation as well, including potentially Wichita State as a non-football member. The latest from John Wilner, who's a writer at the San Jose Mercury News, who is a Pac-12 insider. He was making predictions. This is, I say the latest, this is not him with intel or inside information. This is him making predictions in an article. Again, want to make sure that that's clear. He implied that he believes the Pac-12 schools will get a deal that's about 2.5 to 3 million more than what those schools in the American Athletic Conference are getting. Is that enough for them to pay a $10 million exit fee and have significant travel costs to come to the Pac-12 schools? Probably not. Maybe not. It depends on a variety of other factors at that spot. But it is something to keep an eye on, because Memphis would be a phenomenal addition for the Pac-12 from a football and basketball perspective. One of the few additions the Pac-12 could pursue that is very obviously a benefit to them and football, and is a school that Gonzaga would sign off on in a heartbeat. There are other schools like North Texas or Texas State that make sense on the football field, but don't make as much sense for Gonzaga. Memphis, though, checks all the boxes. John Canzano, another Pac-12 insider and former guest of the podcast, implied that the Pac-12 could be looking at once again re-engaging with the two Nevada schools, UNLV and Nevada Reno, to potentially add them. Doesn't feel like a great move for the Pac-12 that kind of stomped their feet and said, look what we were able to do. We rebuilt a conference, when if they keep just pooching from the Mountain West, doesn't look all that great. But from a basketball perspective, that's pretty good. UNLV, they're mediocre at basketball. They have their moments, but they're in a really strong media market. Getting in Las Vegas is good for the Pac-12. It's good for Gonzaga. It's good for, it'll help UNLV's recruiting if they're in a better conference as well. So that's a good one. Nevada, just a good basketball program. They're not good at football. If you talk to Pac-12 fans who are basketball fans, they do not care about adding Nevada one teeny tiny bit, but it is a good addition for Gonzaga. Also makes the other rumors still there. It's the reason St. Mary's is still in the conversation. There's a reason Wichita State is still in the conversation. I've heard Creighton. I'm not a big believer in Creighton. I don't see Creighton leaving the Big East to join a conference where football is the priority, where geography is not dramatically better, unless they get a significant amount more money from the Pac-12 than they're getting from the Big East. Everything that we are hearing reported about the potential Pac-12 media rights deals does not imply that Creighton would be getting an overwhelming amount of more money from the Pac-12 than they're getting from the Big East. So I don't see why they would make that jump. Gonzaga jumps because they're getting way more money from the Pac-12 than they are from the WCC. And because there's the fear that the power conferences potentially break off, and the WCC not among those. Big East, safer. Big East already paying Creighton quite well. I don't see that happening. Same with Marquette. I don't see it happening. But St. Mary's, sure. Wichita State, sure. Absolutely could happen. I'm very interested to see if the Pac-12 does eventually pivot towards adding some more basketball-centric schools and prioritizing that, as opposed to, trying to add the best football schools they can, which at this point is just not a lot out there for this conference to pursue. All this to say, when you see Gonzaga and Oregon State playing an 8 p.m. tip-off on ESPN, remember that all of this is a part of this negotiation. It's part of this dance. And for this game to have, obviously it was not a tight game by any stretch, but if this game did well from a TV metrics, which I'm guessing that it probably did, that is going to continue to potentially sweeten the pot for ESPN remaining a partner with Gonzaga as they move into the Pac-12 in 2026. Gonna wrap it up for me today here on the Locked On Zags podcast. Folks, thank you so much for hanging out with me today as we enjoy a fantastic win for Mark Few's club against the Oregon State Beavers. We'll be back later this week. We'll, of course, get you ready for the big-time matchup on Saturday against Randy Bennett and the Gales of St. Mary's in Moraga. That's going to be a blast of a game. We'll get you ready for that one coming up later this week. Thanks again, folks. Enjoy the rest of your day. And as always, go Zags.